The grand lobby of the Waldorf Astoria was buzzing with Wall Street's elite, but billionaire CEO Katherine Montgomery was paralyzed. Her champagne flute slipped, shattering against the imported marble. A solitary pianist in a faded tuxedo was playing a haunting, unfinished melody in the corner. It was a song that had never been recorded, never been published. A song written 15 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday in Brooklyn, strictly for her. And the man playing it was the ghost of the only man she had ever loved. Katherine Montgomery did not believe in ghosts. At 34, as the CEO of Montgomery Enterprises, a global real estate and venture capital empire worth over $8 billion, she dealt in tangible assets, concrete contracts, and ruthless acquisitions. She was a woman carved from ice and steel, known in boardroom circles as a brilliant, unyielding force who never let emotion dictate a single decimal point of her life. Tonight was supposed to be a standard obligation. The annual Pediatric Oncology Gala at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City was a sea of bespoke Tom Ford tuxedos, dazzling Cartier diamonds, and the clinking of baccarat crystal. Katherine stood near a towering ice sculpture, draped in a backless emerald Oscar de la Renta gown, half listening to a hedge fund manager named Donovan rattle on about offshore tax shelters. Then, the ambient background music shifted. Usually, these events hired string quartets or jazz ensembles that faded into the wallpaper, but the hotel's grand Steinway concert piano had just been taken over by a new player. The first few chords struck the air like a physical blow to Katherine's chest. It was a D minor progression, melancholic and slow, sliding into an unexpected, delicate F sharp. Katherine stopped breathing. Donovan was still talking, but his voice became a distant, muffled drone, like a television left on in another room. Her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "It's impossible," she thought, her manicured nails digging painfully into the palms of her hands. "It's a coincidence, a statistical anomaly." But then came the bridge, a complex, cascading run of notes that sounded like rain hitting a tin roof, followed by a sudden, heartbreaking pause. Only one person in the world knew that pause. Only one person knew how the melody was supposed to hesitate, as if the piano itself was taking a shaky breath, before diving into the final chorus. He had called it Astas in October. "Katherine, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost," Donovan asked, finally noticing her absolute stillness. "Excuse me," Katherine whispered, her voice trembling, a sound she hadn't produced in over a decade. She turned away from him, her emerald gown sweeping across the floor as she moved toward the raised mezzanine where the piano sat beneath a cascading crystal chandelier. The crowd parted around her, sensing the sudden, predatory intensity radiating from the billionaire. As she drew closer, the pianist's profile came into view, time violently fractured. 15 years dissolved in the span of a single heartbeat. It was Benjamin Hayes. He was older now. The unruly, sun-kissed hair of the 20-year-old Juilliard dropout she had loved was now cut shorter, heavily threaded, with premature silver at the temples. The sharp, aristocratic jawline was obscured by a rough shadow of a beard, and the tuxedo he wore was a rental, slightly frayed at the cuffs. His shoulders carried a heavy, invisible weight that hadn't been there in his youth. Yet, his hands, those long, expressive fingers that used to map the contours of her face in the dark, danced across the ivory keys with the exact same desperate, soul-shattering grace. Katherine stopped 10 feet away, hiding behind a marble pillar, unable to take another step. She couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. "He took the money," her mind screamed, repeating the mantra that had hardened her heart all those years ago. "He took the $500,000 from your father and walked away. He sold you." But as she watched him play, the anger she had relied on for survival refused to surface. Instead, she noticed something else. Sitting on a velvet stool just a few feet behind the piano bench was a little girl. She looked to be about 7 years old. She had a messy braid of chestnut hair and was wearing a modest, dark blue dress that had clearly been bought off the rack at a discount store, starkly out of place among the billionaire offspring roaming the hotel. The little girl had a coloring book open on her lap, but her eyes were fixed on Benjamin, filled with a profound, quiet adoration. Benjamin struck the final, lingering chord of the song. He let the note hang in the air, echoing through the cavernous lobby, before slowly lifting his hands from the keys. He turned his head and offered the little girl a soft, tired smile. "How was that, Soph?" he asked, his voice deep, raspy, achingly familiar, carrying over the ambient noise of the party. "It was beautiful, Daddy," the little girl chirped. "Daddy!" The word hit Katherine like a physical strike. The reality of his life, a life built entirely without her, crashed down around her, before she could process the overwhelming surge of grief and jealousy. Benjamin turned his gaze back to the crowd. His eyes, the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean, swept across the room. And then they stopped, through the sea of socialites and businessmen. Benjamin's gaze locked directly onto Katherine's. The polite, professional smile on his face vanished instantly. His hands hovered over the keys, frozen. For 10 agonizing seconds, they simply stared at one another across the room. The billionaire CEO and the hotel pianist, the ghosts of Brooklyn, resurrected in the heart of Manhattan. Katherine saw his jaw clench. She expected guilt. She expected shame. Instead, what she saw in Benjamin Hayes's eyes was a flash of pure, unadulterated contempt. He abruptly closed the fallboard of the Steinway with a loud crack, stood up, and reached for his daughter's hand. He was running away. Again. "Ben, wait!" Katherine abandoned all billionaire decorum, pushing past a group of startled senators and their wives. She practically ran toward the service corridor behind the ballroom, the heavy silk of her dress rustling furiously. The heavy double doors swung shut just as she reached them. She pushed through into the harsh, fluorescent-lit backstage area used by the hotel staff. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the orchids and expensive perfumes in the lobby. Benjamin was halfway down the hall, holding a battered leather sheet music briefcase in one hand and the little girl's hand in the other. "Benjamin!" Katherine called out, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. He stood rigid, his broad shoulders tensed under the cheap fabric of his tuxedo jacket. "Keep walking, Sophie," Ben muttered quietly to the girl, handing her the briefcase. "Go wait by the time clock for me. Don't talk to anyone." "But Dad, your gig isn't over." "Do as I say, sweetie." "Just for a minute." Sophie glanced back at Katherine with wide, curious eyes before scurrying down the hallway, her small shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Once she was out of earshot, Benjamin finally turned around. Up close, the years were even more apparent on his face. The boyish charm had been replaced by the rugged, weathered look of a man who had fought a losing battle with the world for a very long time. But his eyes were exactly the same. "Ms. Montgomery," he said. The formal title felt like a slap to the face. His voice was completely devoid of warmth. It was as cold as the ice sculptures in the ballroom. "Enjoying the gala?" Katherine took a step forward, her heart hammering. "You're playing my song. You just played Astor's in October." "I was playing a requested set list," Ben replied smoothly, his face a perfect mask of indifference. "A client asked for something melancholic. It fit the bill. Don't flatter yourself." "Don't flatter myself?" Katherine gasped. the shock quickly morphing into the familiar, defensive anger she had honed over 15 years. You disappear off the face of the earth. You take my father's money and run, and now you show up playing the song you swore you wrote for me, and you tell me not to flatter myself. Ben's eyes narrowed dangerously. Your father's money? He let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed down the barren corridor. Is that the fairy tale you tell yourself to sleep at night in your penthouse? That I was bought off? It's not a fairy tale. Ben, I saw the check, the $500,000, cashed 2 days after you packed up your apartment and left without a word. A terrifying silence fell over the hallway. Ben stared at her, not with guilt, but with a horrifying mixture of pity and rage. I never took a dime from Charles Montgomery, Ben said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. And I didn't leave without a word. I left after the police officers your father hired dragged me out of Juilliard and handed me a restraining order. I left after you sent your lawyer to my apartment to tell me that my obsessive stalking was damaging your reputation, and that if I ever came near you again, I'd end up in Rikers. Katherine physically recoiled, the color draining entirely from her face. What? No. I never did that. Ben, I waited for you. I waited at the Brooklyn Promenade for 4 hours in the freezing rain. We were supposed to run away to Chicago. The memory hit her with the force of a freight train. It was 2011. They had been living in a cramped, drafty apartment in Greenpoint. He was working 3 jobs to pay for conservatory. She was a rebellious heiress hiding from her tyrannical father, Charles Montgomery. Charles had threatened to disinherit her if she stayed with the penniless piano player. She hadn't cared. She loved Ben. On a rainy Tuesday, Ben had dragged a beat-up Yamaha upright into the apartment, sat her down, and played Asters in October. This is my vow, he had whispered, resting his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring, Kate. I don't have a fortune. But I have this. Every time I play it, it means I'm yours. 3 days later, he was gone. Her father had presented her with a copy of a cleared check for $500,000, signed by Benjamin Hayes. Charles had looked at her with smug satisfaction and said, Every man has his price. Katherine, good thing we found his before the wedding. I stood at the promenade, Katherine choked out, pulling herself back to the sterile hotel hallway. You never showed. Because I was sitting in a holding cell in the 114th precinct, Ben snarled, taking a step toward her, the raw agony of 15 years bleeding through his stoic facade. Your father had me arrested on trumped-up trespassing charges. I used my one phone call to call you, Kate. You know who answered? Your father. He told me you were sitting right next to him. He told me you laughed when he asked if he should bail me out. Katherine's knees buckled slightly. She reached out and grabbed the metal handle of a utility cart to steady herself. No. He told me you took the money and went to Europe. He showed me the check. Your father owns banks. Kate, he can forge a cancelled check in his sleep, Ben said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked away, staring down the hallway where his daughter had gone. It doesn't matter anymore. It's ancient history. It matters to me, Katherine cried, stepping closer, desperately wanting to reach out and touch his face, but terrified he would pull away. Ben, if we were lied to, if my father orchestrated all of this. What difference does it make? Ben snapped, turning back to her with fierce, burning eyes. Look at you. You're the CEO. You're everything he wanted you to be. You're Charles Montgomery in a designer dress. You buy up neighborhoods. You evict families. You gut companies. You didn't just survive your father. Kate, you became him. The words cut deeper than any knife ever could, because she knew they were true. The heartbreak of losing him had turned her into a machine. And look at me, Ben continued, gesturing to his frayed suit. I play background music for people who spend more on a bottle of wine than I make in a year. I have a 7-year-old daughter who needs me. I don't have the time or the energy to play out some tragic romance with a billionaire. Who is she? Katherine whispered, unable to stop the tears from finally spilling over her dark mascara. Who is her mother? Ben's jaw tightened. Her name was Sarah. She was a nurse at the hospital where I worked as an orderly after Juilliard kicked me out. She picked up the pieces you and your father left behind, and she died of cancer 3 years ago. Katherine let out a broken sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Ben, I'm so sorry. Don't, Ben warned, his voice thick with emotion. He took a step back, retreating behind his walls. Keep your pity, Miss Montgomery, keep your billions. And please, just stay out of my life. Without another word, Benjamin turned and walked down the hallway, scooping up his daughter and disappearing out the service doors into the cold New York night. Katherine was left standing alone in the fluorescent-lit corridor, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the gala she ruled, feeling entirely and utterly bankrupt. The next morning, the sprawling, glass-enclosed corner office of Montgomery Enterprises on the 60th floor of the Freedom Tower felt like a prison. Katherine sat behind her massive mahogany desk, overlooking the sprawling expanse of Manhattan. To anyone else, the view was a testament to absolute power. To her, it just looked like a million places where Benjamin Hayes had been suffering while she sat on a throne built by a liar. Her father, Charles, had died of a sudden stroke 5 years ago. Katherine had shed no tears at his funeral, stepping over his grave to take the reins of the company with ruthless efficiency. She thought she had won. She thought she had outlived the monster. Now, she realized the monster's ghost was still directing her life from beyond the grave. Ms. Montgomery, a voice interrupted. Katherine blinked, tearing her gaze from the window. Standing in the doorway was Thomas O'Malley, a grizzled, retired NYPD detective she kept on retainer for corporate espionage and high-level background checks. She had called him at 2 a.m. the night before. "Come in, O'Malley," Katherine said, her voice hoarse. She hadn't slept a single minute. "Tell me you have something." O'Malley stepped into the room, tossing a thick manila folder onto her desk. He looked at her with a mix of professional detachment and mild concern. "I dug into Benjamin Hayes, just like you asked. It wasn't hard to find him. He hasn't exactly been living off the grid, just living under it," O'Malley said, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs. Katherine opened the folder. The first thing she saw was a grainy DMV photo of Ben. Her chest tightened. "Walk me through it." He dropped out of Juilliard in 2011. Transcripts show he was technically expelled due to unexcused absences, which happens to line up exactly with a 3-day stint in the 114th Precinct holding cell. Arrested for trespassing at a private estate in the Hamptons, your family's estate. I noticed. Katherine closed her eyes. God, it was true. All of it. Charges were mysteriously dropped on the condition he agreed to a permanent restraining order. O'Malley continued, reading from his notes. After that, he fell off the map for a bit, worked manual labor, hospital orderly, night shifts, married a Sarah Jenkins in 2017. They had a daughter, Sophie, in 2019. Ben told me his wife passed away, Katherine whispered, staring at a printout of a modest obituary. O'Malley nodded grimly. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed in 2021, passed in 2023. And this is where it gets really ugly. Ms. Montgomery. Sarah was uninsured for the first part of her treatment. They drained their savings, took out second mortgages, maxed out credit cards to pay for experimental treatments at Sloan Kettering. Katherine flipped the page. A spreadsheet of Ben's financials was laid out before her. The red ink was suffocating. He's over $600,000 in medical debt, O'Malley stated plainly. He works 3 jobs. He teaches piano lessons at a community center in Queens during the day, plays the hotel circuits at night, and works weekends as a shift manager at a diner. He's 2 months behind on rent for a 2-bedroom walk-up in Astoria. He's drowning, boss. Katherine stared at the numbers. $600,000. It was a rounding error in her quarterly reports. It was less than what she had spent renovating the lobby of her London office last month. Yet, this debt was systematically crushing the man she loved. "And the check?" Katherine asked, her voice trembling with an anger so profound it terrified her. "The $500,000 from my father in 2011, O'Malley sighed. "I pulled the archival banking records from the holding company your father used. The check was cut, yes, but it was never cashed by Benjamin Hayes. It was endorsed by a proxy, a shell LLC owned by your father's former fixer, a guy named Marcus Vance. They fabricated the endorsement signature, routed the money through a dummy account, and printed a fake cleared copy to show you. It was a classic corporate smokescreen, just used to ruin a kid's life instead of dodging taxes." The silence in the office was deafening. Katherine's hands shook violently as she closed the folder. 15 years of bitterness, of driving herself into the ground, of destroying her own soul to prove to a ghost that she didn't need him. And Ben. Ben had spent 15 years thinking she was a spoiled, heartless brat who had laughed at his suffering. "Where is he right now?" Katherine asked. Standing up so abruptly, her heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind her. O'Malley checked his watch. "It's 4 p.m. On Tuesdays, he picks his daughter up from PS 84 in Astoria. Then they go to a local diner where he works the evening shift. He keeps her in a booth in the back while he manages the floor." "Get my driver downstairs," Katherine commanded, grabbing her trench coat from the coat rack. "Ms. Montgomery," O'Malley said gently, standing up. "This guy is proud, and he's broken. You walk in there waving your checkbook around. He's going to spit in your face." "I'm not bringing my checkbook, O'Malley," Katherine said, her eyes flashing with a fierce, desperate light. "I'm bringing the truth, and I'm not leaving until he listens." 45 minutes later, Katherine's sleek black Maybach pulled up outside a faded, neon-lit diner in Astoria. The rain had started to fall, slicking the New York pavement and casting long, melancholic reflections of the streetlights. Katherine stepped out into the rain, ignoring her driver offering an umbrella. She needed the cold air to keep her grounded. Through the grease-stained window of the diner, she saw him. Ben was wearing a faded blue apron over a plain gray t-shirt. He was wiping down the counter, laughing at something a regular customer had said. He looked exhausted, but there was a genuine warmth in his smile, a warmth that had been completely absent the night before at the Waldorf. In the back booth, little Sophie was diligently working on a math worksheet, a half-eaten plate of fries beside her. Katherine took a deep breath, pushing the heavy glass door open. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully. Ben didn't look up immediately. "Take any seat you like. I'll be right with—" He froze. The rag in his hand stopped moving over the Formica counter. Slowly, he looked up. Katherine stood just inside the doorway, her expensive trench coat dripping rainwater onto the cheap linoleum floor. She looked entirely out of place in the dingy diner, a billionaire queen stepping into a peasant's world. but her eyes were completely stripped of their corporate armor. She was just Kate again. "I told you," Ben said, his voice instantly dropping in temperature, "to stay out of my life." "I know," Katherine said softly, stepping closer to the counter. "And I will. But not until you look at this." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the thick manila folder O'Malley had given her. She didn't hand him the financial statements. She handed him the banking records, the proof of the forged check, the proof of her father's ultimate betrayal. Ben looked at the folder, then back at her, his jaw set stubbornly. "What is this? A buyout offer?" "Oh, it's my apology," Katherine whispered, her voice breaking. "It's the proof that I never took the money, Ben. It's the proof that my father forged the check to make me think you sold me out. I didn't abandon you, Ben. I was stolen from you. Just like you were stolen from me." Ben stared at the manila folder resting on the counter. The ambient noise of the diner, the clattering of plates, the hum of the old refrigerator, the chatter of customers, seemed to vanish entirely. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached out and opened the file. The neon sign of the diner flickered, casting a sickly, intermittent red glow across the Formica counter. Benjamin Hayes stared at the banking records laid out before him, the ambient clatter of silverware and the low hum of the refrigerated pie case fading into absolute silence. He touched the paper with a trembling index finger, tracing the signature on the back of the cleared check. Benjamin Hayes. The loops were too perfect, the slant too aggressive. It wasn't his handwriting. It was a flawless, soulless forgery. For 15 years, this piece of paper had been the anchor of his resentment. It had been the reason he pushed through double shifts, the reason he swallowed his pride when hotel managers treated him like garbage, and the reason he had built a fortress of cynicism around his heart. He had believed that his profound, universe-altering love had been bought for $500,000. "He told me you laughed," Ben whispered, the words barely making it past the tightness in his throat. He didn't look up at Katherine. He couldn't. "When the police let me make my one call from the precinct. Your father answered your phone. He said you were picking out a dress for a gala. He said you told him to write the check so I would finally stop dragging you down to my level." Katherine gripped the edge of the counter, the knuckles of her pale hands turning white. "I never received a call. Ben, my father took my phone away the night you were arrested. He told me you had packed your bags and vanished. 2 days later, he showed me that check. He said you demanded a buyout to disappear." Ben finally looked up. The deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes were momentarily washed away by a devastating, entirely unguarded grief. The realization was a physical blow. They hadn't fallen apart. They had been deliberately, surgically dismantled by a billionaire who viewed their love as a liability. 15 years. "Kate," Ben said, his voice cracking, the nickname slipping out before he could stop it. "I missed your entire life." Before Katherine could respond, a small tug on Ben's apron broke the heavy atmosphere. "Daddy!" They both looked down. Sophie was standing there, holding her math worksheet. She looked from her father's tear-filled eyes to the woman in the dripping, incredibly expensive trench coat. Sophie tilted her head, her brown eyes widening in recognition. "You're the pretty lady from the hotel lobby," Sophie said softly. "The one who made Daddy stop playing the piano." Katherine felt a shard of ice pierce her chest. She crouched down, her designer coat pooling on the greasy floor, completely indifferent to the ruin of the silk. She looked at the little girl, the child Ben had with a woman who had loved him when Katherine couldn't. "Hi, Sophie," Katherine said, her voice gentle, completely devoid of the boardroom titanium she used to rule Wall Street. I'm Katherine. I'm an old friend of your dad's. From a long, long time ago. Sophie looked at her skeptically. Why are you both crying? Did somebody get hurt? No. Sweetie, Ben said quickly, swiping the back of his hand across his eyes and stepping around the counter to pick his daughter up. Just talking about old times. Go back to the booth, okay? I'll get you some ice cream in a minute. Just as Sophie nodded and settled onto his hip, the bell above the diner door jingled aggressively. Two men walked in. They didn't fit the diner's demographic. They wore sharp, tailored charcoal suits and carried identical leather briefcases. They bypassed the "Please wait to be seated" sign and marched directly toward the counter. Katherine, instinctively reading the room with her corporate instincts, recognized the breed immediately. They weren't mobsters. They were worse. They were collections attorneys. Benjamin Hayes, the taller of the two, asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Ben's spine stiffened. He set Sophie down behind him, shielding her with his body. I'm working. You can't do this here. Actually, Mr. Hayes, we can, the man said, smoothly, pulling a thick stack of stapled documents from his briefcase. We represent Apex Capital, the firm that recently acquired the debt portfolio from Sloan Kettering. You are 60 days delinquent on your restructured payment plan for the medical debts incurred by Sarah Hayes. We are officially serving you with a notice of wage garnishment and an intent to seize declared assets. Ben's face drained of all color. I mailed the check on Friday. It was only 3 days late. 3 days constitutes a breach of the restructuring agreement. The second suit added clinically, we will be garnishing 60% of all documented wages, and the court order allows for the seizure of the Yamaha upright piano listed in your 2023 asset declaration. Have a pleasant evening. The man slapped the papers onto the counter, right on top of the forged $500,000 check. Katherine felt the air leave her lungs. The public humiliation was absolute. The few patrons in the diner were staring. Ben stood completely frozen, his shoulders hunched, completely stripped of his dignity in front of his child. Wait! Katherine snapped, stepping forward, the billionaire CEO roaring back to life. She glared at the two men with a ferocity that made them physically step back. Apex Capital, you're going after a single father's piano over a 3-day delay. Who is your managing director? The taller suit sneered. I don't see how that is your concern. Lady, my name is Katherine Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Enterprises, she said, her voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. And if you don't take these papers off this counter right now, I will personally see to it that Apex Capital is investigated by the SEC for predatory asset seizure before the markets open tomorrow. The men exchanged a nervous glance, recognizing the name. Montgomery Enterprises was a titan. Kate, stop, Ben said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the diner like a whip. Katherine turned to him. Ben, let me handle... I said stop! Ben barked, his eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger. He grabbed the legal papers and shoved them into his apron. I don't need you to rescue me. I don't need Charles Montgomery's money fixing my life. It's my money, Ben, not his. It's the same thing, Ben shot back, breathing heavily. He looked at her, his pride wounded, bleeding out on the diner floor. You walk in here after 15 years, drop a file that proves my entire adult life is a tragedy built on a lie, and then you try to buy my problems away. You think you can just swipe a credit card and fix the fact that I'm drowning. I'm trying to help you, Katherine pleaded, tears welling up again. I don't want your help, Ms. Montgomery, Ben said, retreating back into his cold, defensive shell. He turned his back to her, picking up his rag to furiously wipe the counter. "I want you to leave." Katherine stood there for a long moment, the silence ringing in her ears. She looked at Sophie, who was peeking out from behind the register, looking frightened, defeated. Katherine picked up her ruined trench coat and walked out into the rain. The next morning, the climate inside the Montgomery Enterprises executive boardroom was downright glacial. Katherine stood at the head of the long glass table, staring at a projection screen displaying the corporate structure of Apex Capital. Her chief financial officer and her legal team sat in terrified silence. She had called an emergency meeting at 6 a.m. "I want the Sloan Kettering debt portfolio," Katherine said, her voice clipped and devoid of any emotion. "And I want it by noon." "Katherine, be reasonable," her CFO argued cautiously. "Apex Capital is run by Bradley Carmichael. The man is a scavenger. He buys distressed medical debt for pennies on the dollar and bleeds the families dry. But the portfolio itself is worth over $40 million. If we try to buy it directly, Carmichael will smell blood in the water. He hates you. He'll jack up the price or refuse to sell just out of spite." Bradley Carmichael was a notorious Wall Street bottom feeder, a man who had repeatedly clashed with Katherine's father, and now relished trying to undermine her. "I didn't say buy it directly," Katherine countered, tapping a laser pointer against the screen. "Carmichael is currently highly over-leveraged on a commercial real estate deal in Chicago. A deal, need I remind you, that Montgomery Enterprises holds the mezzanine debt on. Call his commercial lenders. Spook them. Threaten to call in our loans. Squeeze his liquidity until he can't breathe." The legal team shifted uncomfortably. "That's a hostile maneuver, Ms. Montgomery. It borders on corporate warfare." "Then buy some armor, gentlemen," Katherine said coldly. "When Carmichael panics and needs fast cash by lunchtime, have our shell company in Delaware, Sterling Holdings, offer to buy his medical debt portfolio at a 10% premium. He'll take the cash to save his Chicago deal. Once we own the portfolio, locate the file for Sarah and Benjamin Hayes, erase it, discharge the debt entirely. We'd be taking a massive loss on paper just to discharge one file," the CFO pointed out. "I don't care," Katherine said, her eyes burning with an intensity that brooked absolutely no argument. "Get it done!" By 2 p.m., the trap had been sprung. Carmichael, suffocated by the sudden squeeze on his real estate loans, liquidated his medical debt portfolio to the anonymous Delaware shell company. By 3 p.m., Katherine sat alone in her office and hit a single key on her laptop, officially dissolving $600,000 of Benjamin Hayes's medical debt into the digital ether. She didn't do it to buy his love. She did it because the thought of a debt collector taking the piano Ben had used to write Asters in October made her physically sick. 3 days passed. Katherine buried herself in work, refusing to look at her phone, terrified of the fallout. On Thursday evening, the private elevator to her sprawling Tribeca penthouse chimed. Katherine, wearing silk pajamas and holding a glass of scotch she hadn't touched, walked out of her living room to find Benjamin standing in her foyer. He had somehow bypassed her building's security. He was wearing his faded gray jacket, his hair damp from the autumn drizzle. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled, heavy stock letter. "A zero balance," Ben said, his voice echoing in the massive, modern space filled with priceless modern art and cold steel fixtures. He held the letter up. "I get the mail today," and suddenly, $600,000 disappears. A mysterious holding company bought the debt and discharged it as a philanthropic tax write-off. Katherine stood her ground, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "That sounds like a lucky break." Ben closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. The smell of rain and cheap diner coffee radiating off him made Katherine's knees weak. It smelled exactly like their old apartment in Brooklyn. Do not play games with me. Kate, Ben warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You bought me, just like your father tried to do. I didn't buy you, Katherine fired back, slamming her scotch glass down on a marble console table. I protected you. Those vultures were going to take your piano. They were going to garnish the wages you used to feed your daughter. What was I supposed to do? Sit in my ivory tower and watch you drown because your pride is too massive to accept help? Yes! Ben shouted, his voice cracking with raw, unbridled emotion. Because my pride is all I have left. I spent 15 years feeling like I wasn't enough for you. Kate, like I was a worthless charity case who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as the Montgomery family. And now you just wave a wand and erase my burdens. It makes me feel exactly the same way. Katherine felt a tear slip down her cheek. She stepped forward, ignoring his anger, closing the final few inches between them. She reached up, her trembling fingers gently touching his jawline, feeling the rough stubble. Ben flinched, but he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, a shudder ripping through his broad shoulders. I didn't do it because you're a charity case, Katherine whispered, her voice breaking. I did it because I love you. I never stopped. For 15 years. I have walked into boardrooms and destroyed people just so I wouldn't have to feel the hole you left in my chest. I bought that debt because it was hurting you. And anyone who hurts you is my enemy. Ben opened his eyes. The stormy Atlantic gray was swirling with decades of repressed agony and desperate longing. You can't buy 15 years of grief. Kate, he whispered hoarsely. I know, she replied, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the frantic, beautiful beating of his heart. But I can buy us a chance to start over. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Ben's arm slowly came up, tentatively wrapping around her waist, pulling her into the warmth of his chest. It was a fragile, terrifying surrender. But down on Wall Street, predators never slept. Bradley Carmichael sat behind his sleek, minimalist desk in the Apex Capital headquarters, staring at a thick dossier. His face was twisted into a snarl of pure venom. He had spent the last 48 hours tracing the labyrinthine corporate structures of the Delaware shell company that had forced him to liquidate his medical debt portfolio. He had expected a rival equity firm. What he found was Montgomery Enterprises. Katherine Montgomery had engineered a massive, illegal squeeze on his commercial loans just to trick him into selling a specific set of distressed assets. It made no financial sense. It was a purely emotional play. And Carmichael knew that in the corporate world. Emotion was a fatal weakness. Why? Carmichael asked his lead investigator, a shadowy corporate fixer who stood across the desk. Why would she take a $40 million loss to acquire garbage medical debt? We cross-referenced the discharged accounts, the investigator said smoothly. Only one account was completely wiped clean. A Benjamin Hayes. 600 grand in cancer treatments for his late wife. I dug into him. He's a nobody, a piano player. But 15 years ago, he was Katherine Montgomery's college boyfriend. Charles Montgomery actually had him arrested to keep him away from her. Carmichael leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. The pieces were falling into place. The Ice Queen of Wall Street had a vulnerability. He has a kid, right? Carmichael asked, his mind working at lightning speed. A 7-year-old daughter, Sophie. And Hayes is poor? Dirt poor. Behind on rent, works 3 jobs, erratic hours. He keeps the kid in the back of a diner until midnight sometimes. Carmichael's smile widened into something truly sinister. Katherine just proved she will burn her own company to the ground to protect this man. which means, if I control him, I control her. I want Montgomery's tech acquisition division. She outbid me last month. How do we use Hayes? We don't, Carmichael said smoothly, picking up his phone. We use the state. File an anonymous report with Child Protective Services in Queens. Flag the sudden, unexplained injection of corporate funds from a billionaire CEO into a poor single father's account. Suggest illicit money laundering. Suggest an unsafe environment. Frame it like Katherine is paying him off for something nefarious involving the child. Get a caseworker down to his apartment tonight. Rattle his cage until he breaks. At 8 p.m., Ben was sitting at his battered Yamaha upright piano in his cramped Astoria apartment, quietly playing the bridge to Astor's in October. Sophie was asleep on the worn sofa, covered in a faded quilt. For the first time in a decade, Ben felt a fragile spark of hope. Katherine's confession the night before had rewritten his entire reality. They had talked until dawn, not about money, but about the lost years, about Sarah, about Charles Montgomery's cruelty. They were broken pieces, but they were finally looking at the same puzzle. A sharp, authoritative knock at the apartment door shattered the quiet. Ben frowned. He checked the deadbolt, then cracked the door. Standing in the poorly lit hallway were two uniformed NYPD officers and a stern-looking woman in a gray pantsuit holding a clipboard. "Benjamin Hayes?" the woman asked. "Yes," Ben said, his heart instantly dropping into his stomach. "Keep your voices down, please. My daughter is sleeping. I am Agent Milburn, with the Administration for Children's Services," the woman said coldly, pushing past him into the small apartment. "We received an anonymous, high-priority tip regarding the welfare of a minor, Sophie Hayes. We have the court-ordered mandate to evaluate the living conditions and your current financial and legal standing." Ben stumbled backward, absolute terror gripping him. "Wait, what? A tip? From who? I'm a good father," Agent Milburn sneered, looking around the cramped, drafty apartment. She noted the peeling paint, the stack of past-due utility bills on the counter, and the worn-out furniture. "Mr. Hayes, our reports indicate you work erratic, unsupervised night shifts, keeping the child in commercial kitchens. Furthermore, we have documentation showing a highly suspicious, sudden corporate payoff of over $600,000 tied to Montgomery Enterprises. We are investigating whether this constitutes illegal financial structuring, or worse, endangerment and trafficking." "Trafficking?" Ben yelled, the word tearing out of his throat. The officers instantly put their hands on their utility belts. "Are you insane? That was medical debt. My wife had cancer." "Keep your voice down, sir," one of the officers warned. "You're investigating my connection to Katherine Montgomery," Ben realized, the blood freezing in his veins. The pieces snapped together. This wasn't a random welfare check. This was a hit. Someone was weaponizing his daughter against Katherine. "Given the discrepancies in your income and the hazardous living conditions, I am recommending a temporary, emergency removal of the child pending a full investigation," Milburn said, clicking her pen. "No!" Ben screamed, throwing himself between the agent and the sofa where Sophie was beginning to stir, rubbing her eyes. "You are not touching her. You are not taking my daughter." The two officers stepped forward, pulling zip ties from their belts, desperate, operating purely on adrenaline. Ben pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. He didn't call a lawyer. He couldn't afford one. He hit the only number that mattered. "Kate." Ben choked out the second she answered, tears streaming down his face as the officers closed in. "Kate, they're taking her. They're taking Sophie." Katherine Montgomery's cell phone slipped from her hand, clattering against the imported marble floor of her Tribeca penthouse. The terrified, broken sound of Benjamin's voice echoing from the speaker sent a shock wave of pure, unadulterated ice through her veins. "They're taking Sophie." In the cutthroat world of Wall Street, Katherine was known as a master strategist, a woman who could calculate risk and execute multi-billion-dollar acquisitions without a single fluctuation in her heart rate. But this was not a boardroom. This was the man she loved and the child he would die for. The paralyzing grief that had defined her for 15 years instantly evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, volcanic rage. She snatched the phone off the floor. "Ben, put me on speakerphone. Right now. In the cramped, drafty apartment in Astoria." Ben fumbled with his device, his eyes locked on the two NYPD officers who were advancing with zip ties. He hit the speaker button. "Officers." Katherine's voice snapped through the tiny speaker, resonating with an absolute, lethal authority that stopped the men in their tracks. "My name is Katherine Montgomery. I am the CEO of Montgomery Enterprises. You are currently standing in an apartment with a man who is under the direct legal protection of my corporate umbrella. If you touch him, or that child, I will personally ensure that your badges are melted down and your pensions are tied up in federal litigation until the end of the century." Agent Milburn, recovering from her initial shock, stepped toward the phone. "Ms. Montgomery, this is a state-sanctioned emergency intervention by the Administration for Children's Services. You have no jurisdiction here. The anomalous financial deposits linked to your company are precisely what triggered this investigation." "Agent Milburn," Katherine replied, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Look out the window." Milburn frowned, crossing the small living room to pull back the faded curtains. Down on the rain-slicked street, a convoy of 3 black armored Cadillac Escalades had just violently jumped the curb, blocking the entire avenue. "I live 12 minutes from Astoria when my drivers don't care about traffic laws," Katherine said through the phone. "I am walking up the stairs, and I am not alone." Less than 30 seconds later, the flimsy door of Ben's apartment was practically shoved off its hinges. Katherine strode into the room. She was still wearing her silk pajamas, but she had thrown a massive, dark cashmere coat over them. Her eyes were burning with a predatory fire. Flanking her were 3 men in impeccably tailored suits. "Ms. Montgomery, you are interfering with a federal—" Milburn began, her voice suddenly trembling. "Shut your mouth," Katherine barked, not even looking at the agent. She walked straight to Ben, positioning her body between him, Sophie, and the police. She looked at her lead counsel. "William, educate them." William Ford, a legendary corporate litigator whose hourly rate could buy a sports car, stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply opened a leather portfolio and handed a document to the nearest police officer. "That is a writ of preliminary injunction, signed 5 minutes ago by a New York State Supreme Court judge whom I woke up from a deep sleep," William stated smoothly. "It strictly prohibits the removal of Sophie Hayes from the custody of her father without a full evidentiary hearing. Furthermore, the anomalous financial deposit Agent Milburn cited is a documented, legally binding philanthropic debt discharge executed by a Delaware holding company. It is entirely legal, heavily taxed, and utterly none of your business." Milburn's face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. "We received an anonymous tip, a high-priority red flag, regarding child endangerment and trafficking." "Yes, and we have already subpoenaed the telecom records of that tip," William countered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Filing a false report to weaponize Child Protective Services is a Class E felony. I suggest you leave this premises immediately, Agent Milburn, before you find yourself named as a co-conspirator in a federal extortion lawsuit." The 2 police officers looked at the Supreme Court injunction, then at William Ford, and finally at Katherine Montgomery, who looked ready to burn the building down with her bare hands. They silently holstered their zip ties and backed out the door. Milburn, realizing she was entirely outmatched, snatched her clipboard and followed them, her face pale with terror. The heavy silence returned to the apartment, broken only by the sound of the rain against the window. Ben fell to his knees, his entire body shaking as the adrenaline drained from his system. He pulled Sophie into his chest, burying his face in her chestnut hair. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, crying softly. Katherine dismissed her lawyers with a curt nod. They immediately stepped out into the hallway, closing the broken door behind them. She took a slow, shuddering breath, the invincible billionaire facade melting away to reveal the terrified woman underneath. She dropped to her knees on the scuffed linoleum floor, wrapping her arms around both Benjamin and Sophie. "They're gone," Katherine whispered fiercely into Ben's shoulder. "I've got you. Nobody ever taking her away. I swear to you." Ben held on to Katherine as if she were the only solid thing left in the universe. He didn't pull away. He didn't mention his pride, or the money, or the 15 years of silence. In the crucible of nearly losing his daughter, all the defensive walls he had built were reduced to ash. "Lloyd, they targeted her. Kate," Ben choked out, his voice raw. "They used my little girl to get to you." Katherine pulled back just enough to look into his stormy gray eyes. Her expression was completely devoid of mercy. "I know," Katherine said, gently wiping a tear from Sophie's cheek before standing up. "Pack a bag. Ben, you and Sophie are coming to my home. And tomorrow morning, I am going to teach Bradley Carmichael what it actually means to ruin a life." The sun had barely risen over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, razor-sharp shadows across the financial district, when Katherine Montgomery walked through the glass double doors of Apex Capital. She did not wait for the receptionist to announce her. She bypassed the security desk, her heels clicking ominously against the polished terrazzo floor, followed closely by Thomas O'Malley and William Ford. Bradley Carmichael was sitting behind his desk, sipping an espresso and reviewing quarterly projections, entirely confident in his shadow gambit. When his office doors flew open, he looked up, expecting to see a broken, desperate Katherine Montgomery, ready to hand over her tech acquisition division in exchange for Ben's safety. Instead, he saw a sheer, unadulterated executioner. "Katherine," Carmichael drawled, recovering quickly and flashing a shark-like smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Decided you want to negotiate the sale of that tech division after all." Katherine walked slowly to his desk. She didn't sit. She planted both hands on the edge of his mahogany desk and leaned in. "I am not here to negotiate, Bradley. I am here to watch you bleed." Carmichael chuckled, though a bead of sweat nervously formed at his temple. "Melodrama doesn't suit you. Kate, I don't know what you're talking about." Thomas O'Malley stepped forward and tossed a heavy, black binder onto Carmichael's desk. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud. "Last night," Katherine began, her voice completely devoid of warmth, "you used a burner voice account to call the Queen's Division of Child Protective Services. You fabricated a story about child trafficking to trigger a traumatic, armed raid on the home of a single father. You did this to terrorize a 7-year-old girl, hoping it would give you leverage over me. You can't prove any of that," Carmichael scoffed, though his smile had completely vanished. "An anonymous tip is anonymous. Not when you route the IP address through a proxy server that your firm's IT department pays for with a corporate credit card." O'Malley grunted, crossing his arms. "I've been awake all night. Bradley, I own the digital footprint of every keystroke your tech guys made. I have the audio recording of the 911 call, and a voice recognition analysis that matches it to your lead investigator with a 99% certainty." Carmichael's face went completely ashen. He stared at the black binder as if it were a live grenade. Filing a false CPS report is a felony, William Ford added clinically from the doorway. Extortion is a federal crime. RICO statutes apply when you utilize your corporate entity to conduct coordinated harassment and illegal surveillance. You wanted my tech division, Katherine said softly, the lethal calm in her voice far more terrifying than if she had been screaming. You thought because my father used Benjamin Hayes to break my heart 15 years ago, you could use him to break my company today. You made a catastrophic miscalculation, Bradley. You assumed I was still the victim. Carmichael swallowed hard. What? What do you want? Katherine, you want me to back off? Fine. I'll drop the inquiries. We walk away. A draw. There is no draw, Katherine said, standing up straight. By 9:00 a.m., Montgomery Enterprises is going to announce a hostile takeover of Apex Capital. You are going to instruct your board to accept the buyout at 14 cents on the dollar. You are going to sign over every asset, every distressed debt portfolio, and every commercial lease you own to my firm. Carmichael shot out of his chair, his face purple with rage. Are you out of your mind? That's a total liquidation. You're talking about wiping out my entire net worth. I am, Katherine agreed pleasantly. And, if you refuse, William walks out of this room and hands that binder to the U.S. Attorney's office. You will be arrested before lunch. You will face a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for the extortion scheme alone. And while you are rotting in a cell, I will spend millions to systematically bankrupt everyone you have ever cared about. The silence in the office was suffocating. Carmichael looked from the binder to O'Malley's hardened glare, to William's stoic legal presence, and finally to Katherine. He searched her eyes for a bluff, for any sign of hesitation or mercy. He found absolutely nothing. She was completely, utterly hollowed out of any sympathy for him. Defeated, Carmichael slumped back into his chair. His hands shook as he reached for his Mont Blanc pen. You're a monster, Carmichael whispered. No, Katherine replied, turning her back on him and walking toward the door. I'm Charles Montgomery's daughter, and you just threatened my family. 6 months later, the bitter chill of the New York winter had melted away, surrendering to the vibrant, blooming warmth of spring. The sprawling Montgomery estate in the Hamptons, the very place Benjamin had been falsely arrested for trespassing 15 years prior, was bathed in golden twilight. The massive French doors of the main house were thrown open, letting the gentle ocean breeze sweep through the grand ballroom. The room was entirely empty of guests, devoid of the corporate sharks and socialites that usually haunted Katherine's world. There was no catering staff, no press, no bodyguards. There was only a beautifully restored 1920s Steinway grand piano sitting in the center of the room. Benjamin Hayes sat on the leather bench. He was not wearing a frayed, rented tuxedo. He wore a simple, tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. The heavy, exhausting shadows that had darkened his eyes for a decade and a half were entirely gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace. Across the room, Sophie was sprawled out on a Persian rug, giggling as she tried to teach a very uncoordinated golden retriever puppy how to roll over. Katherine stood by the open French doors, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching them. She was barefoot, wearing a simple white sundress. The Billionaire armor was locked away in a high-rise in Manhattan. Here, she was just Kate. The transition hadn't been seamless. 15 years of trauma and mistrust couldn't be erased overnight. There had been long, tearful conversations in the dark, moments of insecurity, and the slow, delicate process of Ben allowing himself to accept that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore. But they had done the work. Katherine had formally adopted Sophie, and Ben had finally returned to his true passion, accepting a position as a composer in residence at a conservatory Katherine had heavily endowed. Ben's hands hovered over the ivory keys of the Steinway. He looked across the room, his eyes finding Katherine's. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," Ben said, his raspy voice echoing warmly in the vast space. 15 years, actually. I could never find the right progression to finish it. Every time I tried, it just felt broken, like it was missing the anchor. Katherine smiled softly, walking slowly across the polished hardwood floor until she was standing right beside the piano. She rested her hand gently on his shoulder. "And now?" she asked. Ben reached up, his long, expressive fingers covering her hand, pulling it down so he could press a kiss to her knuckles. "Now, when the anchor is here," he turned back to the keys. He took a slow, steadying breath and began to play. It was Astor's in October. The opening chords were exactly the same as they had been in that drafty Brooklyn apartment, and exactly the same as they had been in the Waldorf Astoria lobby. The D minor progression, melancholic and slow, sliding into the delicate F sharp. It was a melody born of desperation, a vow made by a penniless boy to a runaway girl. Katherine closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She felt the tears welling up. But they weren't tears of grief or bitterness. They were tears of absolute, profound relief. Ben played through the bridge, the cascading run of notes that sounded like rain hitting a tin roof. And then came the pause, the heartbreaking hesitation where the song had always stopped, suspended in time by lies and forged checks and stolen years. But this time, the music didn't stop. Ben's hands moved with a sudden, breathtaking confidence. The melancholy minor keys transitioned violently, beautifully, into a sweeping, triumphant major chord progression. It was rich, complex, and overwhelmingly hopeful. It sounded like the sun breaking through a brutal storm. It sounded like a man who had walked through hell and finally found his way home. Sophie stopped playing with the puppy, sitting up on the rug to watch her father, completely mesmerized by the beautiful sound filling the room. Ben struck the final, resonant chord, letting the perfect harmony echo through the Hamptons estate, washing away the ghosts of Charles Montgomery once and for all. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed feeling warmer and heavier than the music itself. Katherine leaned down, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. She inhaled the scent of him, no longer smelling of cheap diner coffee and rain, but of sea salt and safety. "It's finished," Ben whispered, turning his head to press his forehead against hers. "I promised you 15 years ago. Kate, every time I play it, it means I'm yours." Katherine looked at him, her heart completely whole, then glanced over at Sophie, who was smiling brightly at them. "We're finally home, Ben," Katherine said softly, kissing him as the last echo of the melody faded into the ocean breeze. "All of us." Did Katherine's ruthless, boardroom-style defense of the man she loved give you chills? From a devastating forgery that tore them apart to a multi-million-dollar corporate takedown to protect a little girl. Ben and Katherine proved that true love can survive even the darkest betrayals. If you were captivated by this incredible story of second chances, ultimate revenge, and the healing power of a single piano melody, don't keep it to yourself. Drop a like, leave a comment with your favorite twist, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more heart-stopping, real-life drama stories.